Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's meeting. My name is Councillor Patrick Walsh, and I'm the chair of this committee. A few housekeeping points before we begin. This meeting is being live streamed on the council's YouTube channel. By participating, you are consenting to being recorded. If the fire alarm sounds, I will adjourn this meeting. Please leave the meeting in an orderly fashion by the nearest exit, which is in the lift lobby and down the stairs. Officers will direct you to the assembly point, which is on Shortlands Road. Okay, so moving to item 1, apologies for absence, which none have been received. And moving along to item 2, do members have any declarations of interest they wish to make note? Okay, hearing none. Moving along to item 3, do members agree that the minutes of the previous meeting held on the 13th of March 2023 are a true and accurate reflection? Agreed. Perfect. In that case, moving along to item number 4, annual health and safety work report for the financial year 22-23. And can I ask Paul Neary to introduce the item?
Paul Neary, Head of Health and Safety, Corporate Health and Safety. You've already had the report, I take it. There's been some good work during the last year, 2023. The most important one for me is that we have no HSE involvement, despite reporting a number of errors to them. They didn't deem they needed to be investigated any further. Corporate health and safety investigate all incidents, and so far so good.
Excellent. Is there any questions from members of the committee?
Just a very quick one, if I may. I assume you're talking about the riders. Are there sort of lower level accidents that would be reported just as a precautionary matter to the agency?
No, I'm talking about riders, reported into industry, industrial. You know that anyway. Yeah. No, they're all minor incidents, and that is why the HSE didn't do anything to investigate.
It wouldn't be the report ones that are below the threshold, but are
anything that falls within the real group I would report.
Okay, but anything under the
Councillor Pascal-Tilbury.
Thanks very much. Note that the number of reports for 2023 is quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
Is that just a function of no longer being locked down?
I think we're starting to get more reports in now. People getting back to the office. We, as part of our training, we're getting members to report more incidents. I still suspect in some areas there's a little bit of under-reporting, and I've raised it to the individual TMTs. They assure me that they are reporting everything. On recent training sessions, we've been pushing the need to report more, and there's been a bit of an influx of near misses reported, just so we can try and keep near misses to be reported, because if a near miss is reported, it prevents something else further down the line. So even though the figures are showing near misses is up, I see that as a good thing. And as part of the Irish training course, we've got a number of managers through who push this as well.
Councillor Chabot-Villiers.
Thank you. Just a few quick ones. In the report, you talk about personal emergency evacuation plans, and these plans are contained at residence houses in a box. Are they also, do we retain a copy outside of the residence homes, or council workers actually find that information? And my second question is,
Apologies. How about now?
Okay, so
yes.
should
Just need to speak up.
okay, we try down that end. Can you?
What I did before, I think switched it off.
Oh, okay.
So that should be on, but we may need to just speak up from this end.
Sure.
Can you
Okay.
hear me okay, Jackie? Great.
Perfect. Councillor Patel.
Appendix A refers to incidents, including schools reported to assessment. There's an item there called total violence aggression incidents excluding schools. Can you give me more information about that?
We are seeing more violence aggression incidents across the borough, certainly within our front-facing teams, our housing teams, our led team, libraries, certainly in the libraries, in schools, very little, not very little. It's mainly verbal abuse in schools.
Right. And the other thing is you mentioned in this report, paragraph 15, that Soros's monitors have been provided to councillors for use during site visits and surgery meetings. But my surgery takes place at St. Matthew's Church on Moses Bridge Road every other Saturday. And I assure you, I'm the only person that no one should so perhaps that needs to be looked into because it's very unhealthy to be on your own when you're when the public see you. There's no CCTV cameras or anything so on.
I'll have a risk assessment just carried out on that site and get back to us. We're quite happy to join you in one of your meetings. So you're not on your own.
If I may, through Chair, you can request the net officers joining at your surgeries as well. That's what we've done at the College Park. And we also do our surgeries together to make sure that we're not on our own. So that could be an option as well.
Are there any questions? Councillor Pascal.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to get on the sort of verbal and aggression. What training is provided to front-facing officers to be able to manage and diffuse difficult situations?
At present, we are running conflict management training with the library staff. They've tested, and so have the civil enforcement officers team. Their dates have not been set yet. The libraries, they closed down the libraries, two of the libraries, so the majority of people could attend the first session. We closed another one down, so people could attend the second session, and now we have one more session to go, which I think is planned in a couple of weeks' time. And it's all about defusing the situation, looking at the triggers, speaking to people in the way they expect to be spoken to. And the feedback, of course, has been good. I'm not saying we're not still getting issues, but I think the staff feel a bit more comfortable now.
I think that would be potentially quite a good one to roll into housing officers as well.
Yeah, but it's available to anybody. I've got a very small team. We're spread around quite a lot at the moment, but anybody who wants that training. I believe some of the housing officers get it anyway, just losing out the trust.
Thank you.
Okay.
I did have a question just regarding the Hello hybrid futures. Obviously, with work from home becoming more prevalent, I think I asked this question at last year's meeting as well. In terms of the risk assessment to people's home office or home work setup, can you talk a bit about what training is being required of members of staff who are working from home to ensure that they have a proper work setup and that they're not putting themselves at risk of things like repetitive strain injuries from a poor setup.
There is DSC training for all staff. They complete the questionnaire. They ask for the equipment they need. That is shared with our team. One member of my team looks through it all, checks, see what they need, and make sure it's delivered to their homes. There's more and more people coming back into the office now. So I think that's taken away a lot of the issues we have with people home and with hybrid workers across the country. Same issues.
And in terms of the kind of like the long-term home office and home working setups, are you confident that people are putting forward the requests for adequate equipment and that they are asking for what they need?
They are doing, and they're getting it delivered very quickly. But now we're seeing more and more people coming back into the office. Certainly some teams back in full time. Some of the small teams, my team are all home workers. They come to us when they're required to go out and carry orders and visits. There are a couple of other small teams that don't spend much time in the office. But we are seeing a lot more people moving back into the offices, which is good.
And maybe a question for the CEO, where people have moved office or where people are now back in office full time, is the equipment being recovered or the cost of that equipment being recovered again?
Well, we do operate mostly hybrid working, Chair. So people will have a laptop allocated to them that can be used in the office or it can be used at home. It's just the extra things that if they had a bigger screen. But at the moment, I think it's important to get City Campus back open as well. Very important. I mean, we are, as people are saying and acknowledging, we've been moving back into the office for quite a long period of time now. People who need to be in the borough are in the borough. Some people never work from home because it's inappropriate for them to work from home. So, you know, a fairly significant contingent when you had home working, even when we were operating with COVID, because they were redeployed to other duties to help us deal with the COVID emergency. But yes, we do try wherever possible. If there's a role in the borough, that's the priority. But if we can operationally manage, so things that are very back office, then it will suit the work, number one, and the residents for those people to be deployed at home and then have training and team meetings and developments in the office. There shouldn't be anybody that's home all the time. That would not be appropriate for their development. So, but some of our back office functions do particularly well in terms of performance if they're at home. But every one of us, including I, have done it. There is a training that you have to do to complete your home assessments. So and there's a quiz afterwards so that people know that you've done it, and then you scored on it. So the senior management team is sharing our scores just to make sure we've all done it properly. What I would say on this report, Chair, if I may, we take health and safety very, very seriously in this borough at a senior level. We ourselves spend a lot of time looking at what we're doing well. We, like Paul, would expect to see near misses reported to us so we can improve. Always a learning experience, particularly in dynamic situations. And a priority is the safety of the staff, particularly in interactions where people may have challenging circumstances and they're expressing those in quite a confrontational way, and it can be particularly concerning for staff and sometimes even violence. So it is a top priority for us. In the last few years, we've done more than just training people, trying to get messages to residents as well, that obviously we want staff to be treated with respect. And sometimes if you're issuing a parking penalty or something like that, it's immediately into a conflict situation. So the health and well-being of the CEOs and the let officers, with libraries, it can often be about IT and noise from other people that are in the library. One wouldn't expect the library service to be an area that would be hugely challenging in this regard. But unfortunately, it's where people are in their own lives and what stresses and strains they have that can manifest themselves then into difficult circumstances for staff. And we want people to come to work, do a good job and not to be fearful for their personal safety. So it really is a significant priority for us.
Thank you. It's very good to hear. Are there any other questions? Councillor Hospital.
Thank you. Just a quick one from me. On the action plan analysis on compliance, there's a grants. And I think that obviously reflects the standards that we have ourselves to, which is great. Just wanted to know what is being done to target that make good degrees.
Appendix B in the report, which covers what you were talking about there. That report was from 1st of April. Every month that is updated. It was updated in May, June, and it will be updated again in a couple of days' time to reflect where we stand at the moment. As of the 1st of July, of 67 sites, 92.1% compliant. Not all sites require the same services. All fire risk assessments have been completed. We're just waiting for one report to come back from the contractor who's completed it. Mechanical management is at 100% now. That's boilers, pressure cookers, pressure vessels, and electric gates, which we have a few around the borough. Asbestos, 4 out of 38 sites need re-inspections. Our asbestos reports are carried out every 2 years, and re-inspections carried out in between. And Legionella risk assessments, 1 out of 43 sites requires a new Legionella risk assessment. So the figures are, they get better, but they fluctuate. There will be times when our contractors can't get into a site. There might be a day when they want to go to the mortuary to carry out fire risk due to what goes on in the mortuary. They aren't always getting on the day you're required to go, so that will drop into red because you can't get on the day it's due. But arranges pretty very quickly to be a day very close after.
Okay, thank you very much. Perfect. Are there any further questions? Okay. In that case, the recommendation is, do members agree to note the health and safety at work performance of the council during the financial year 22 and 23?
Noted.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. Moving along to item 5, the corporate anti-fraud service end of year report for the 1st of April 22 to the 31st of March 23. And can I ask Andy Hyatt to introduce this item?
Thank you, Chair. The report in front of you has the overview of the anti-fraud activity over the last 12 months of the last financial year. If I can draw your attention to a few items in the report. At 1.7 on page 36, we provide you with an overview of the positive outcomes with the notional value. I think of note there is that we've tried to focus directly on tenancy fraud in particular this year. It's a big issue for the local authority. We've got 36 properties back, which compared to last year's 22 is a marked improvement. And I'm pleased to say that we've got additional resources put into this area. I think it's vital for us. It's an ongoing issue, which nicely brings me on to a new item that you may not have seen before in the report, which is a section on emerging risks and trends. And although you might not see tenancy fraud as a new or emerging risk, I felt it important to highlight that because the circumstances we're currently facing, ranging from an ongoing lack of affordable housing, the cost of living crisis, which may mean that individuals take more risk than before and look for additional income, possibly from subletting, it means the risk isn't going away, unfortunately. So it is a continuing risk. And I just wanted to draw out that to you. There is also highlighted an area regarding moonlighting. I think I should just caveat that on a couple of points. I think first and foremost, please be aware it's not a rife issue, it's a very minor issue, it's not a lot of cases, that's for sure, across London, but it is something that local authorities across London are finding more and more, which is why we've raised it here. What I am pleased to say is that the cases that I've highlighted in this report, they were identified by management controls. So managers are coming to us and saying, I've got a concern about an individual, can you look into it? And that's where they're arising. They're not cases that have just been, someone has tipped us off. These are proper managers identifying a concern and bringing that forward. So I want to just caveat that and make sure you're aware. One of them, in one instance, was also an operative, and also we relied upon another control, which is trackers in vehicles, to see individuals operating outside the authority. So again, it's just to remind you that the controls are there, and whilst I've identified this as a risk, these have been identified because of the controls we have in place. Also, thereafter, the report tends to fall into the 5 pillars that the strategy, counter-fraud strategy that we use, aligns to, which is to govern, acknowledge, prevent, pursue, and protect. And I tried to sort of narrate the report thereafter under each of those headings, so that the activity that we're undertaking, you as the committee can actually see and get some assurance that the work we're doing is aligned to the counter-fraud strategy that we use and that we are adhering to that. I think that's pretty much it, and I'm more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Andy. Are there any questions from members of the committee?
Yeah.
Paul?
Sorry, just on terms of the items that we're encapsulating, Andy. So the tenancy fraud, there's a whole number of ways that tenants can encroach upon to outright breach their tenancy. So the tenancy fraud one, would this be where they have essentially let property to another person and they're no longer in residence there, as opposed to somebody who's got somebody staying over and might be helping with their bills and so.
Yes, Councillor, that's quite right. The ones that we report on here under tenancy fraud, those 36, they are ones where the property was either being unlawfully sublet or abandoned. Now, 9 times out of 10, we call it abandonment because we have a suspicion that someone is there, they're not opening the door, we believe they're subletting, and we just can't prove that. But we're only looking at ones where the resident is no longer there, and therefore breaching the tenant by not being at that property at all. We're not worried, we're not certainly looking at where there might be a lodger in the property. We are looking purely at complete sublets of the property, and therefore the tenant is relinquishing effectively their tenancy and breaching their tenancy.
And would that presumably include elements of council tax fraud and elements of benefit fraud in terms of paying their rent? Because presumably if that's not taking place, it would be far more apparent that they were doing the wrong property.
Yes, it does link into there. It will depend. 9 times out of 10, and I think understandably, the subtenant is going to be a worker, especially where the person who is subletting the property unlawfully is in receipt of benefit. Because obviously, 2 benefit claims from the same address, it will be flagged up, and our colleagues in benefits will alert us to it. So what you tend to find, and I'm talking out of turn, but what you tend to find is that the resident will sublet to an individual who is working, and they will probably charge slightly below market rent, so that it's for the favour of the subtenant, by also saying to them, if the council calls around, don't answer the door, don't tell them anything. They're happy to comply because they may be getting their rent at £50 a week less than what market rents are. So there is those issues where, as far as I'm concerned, they do link into benefit frauds. One of the problems that you may or may not be aware is that we no longer have a jurisdiction over housing benefit fraud. That has all been centralised back to the Department for Work and Pension. Where there's council tax relief scheme, we can still look at that, and we still try to pass the information and the intelligence that we gather onto our colleagues in benefits to try and get those aspects stopped. However, most of them will be on housing benefit linked to the council tax relief scheme, and unfortunately that has to be investigated by the Department for Work and Pensions.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Chivotte.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to start by saying I think it's a very strong report. that shows a lot of important work, and the council's got its focus where it really matters. I wanted to ask you to start on plenty of questions, but to start with understanding, you give us an increased number compared to previous years of what you've actually saved us. Are you able to tell us, and this is positive, but are you able to tell us how much your team costs us so that we can actually think, that's the net amount of money we've saved?
So my team is in the region of £500,000. That's the cost of the service. Now, what you need to be aware of, these are notional figures, obviously. So they're figures that we attribute to a fraud taking place. Now, I'll give you an example of how we come to those figures. If we look at the tenancy frauds, classic example, a number of local authorities use an old figure that arose from the Audit Commission before they were defunct, of around 75 to 100k. I don't necessarily think that that's the right figure to use, because a lot of that is based upon how much it may have cost to buy another unit, which has now escalated. However, what I like to focus on is how much the council is paying from the general fund to house a family in temporary accommodation. And what we do is we take the overall figure that the council is spending, less the income, and we divide that by the number of rooms effectively that we are buying in as such. That gives me a set figure per how much per room costs. I can then multiply that by the number of rooms of the property we get back. Because I do think it's important that we get, or we show, a bigger notional value for the bigger properties. They're the ones in demand. They're the ones we need. 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms are in great demand. So I think we need to show that they are a very expensive commodity, and therefore a slightly higher figure for that, rather than a bland single figure, regardless of whether it's a studio, flat or 5 bed.
So you told us in the report that this year you hired an actual investigator. Could you tell us roughly how much their wages, how much they cost us, rough figure?
Roughly, we're on cost 45k.
Okay, so basically, according to my math, you're exponential, because you cost us less last year, but you gave us back less. We give you more this year, and give us more in return. So the conclusion is, the more we invest in you, the more we get in return.
And with tenancy fraud, that's a given. I've worked elsewhere. That's been the case. The more you invest in tenancy fraud, the chief executive has been very supportive of this. The more we invest in tenancy fraud investigation, the more costs we get back. It's a given almost.
An extra £40,000 this year.
They will get to a point, naturally, they will get to a point where there's only so much you can put in. Because again, unfortunately, because it's such a valuable commodity, people are becoming harder and harder to prove. And that's the reality. It's also quite resource intensive. We talk about health and safety. To visit an address, I need 2 officers. They can't go individually. They also need to have equipment such as like to make sure that they're protected when they're out and visiting. And once they go out sort of from 6:30, and by 9 o'clock, you've lost any chance of finding individuals in, because as we mentioned, subtenants are possibly working. So by 9 o'clock, they're not there. I have a hard working bunch of team who occasionally will do a weekend, because that's a better chance to go 10 o'clock and they might find someone in. If you go at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, that's probably a work, and the person's not there to give you the information. So it's quite resource intensive, hence the reason more resources helps us get out there. And it has twofold effect. It's not just about finding fraud, it's also about proving that that tenant's there. It may be a malicious referral, but what we've proved to the council, we've given them assurance that actually we've done the investigation and we can be satisfied that tenant is there.
I think the other thing I'd highlight to support Andy's saying, actually how the team work well. If you look at 4.19, actually 2/3 of the properties are recovered by asking and getting the tenant to return the keys. And that's a much quicker and cheaper process than having to go to the courts to be able to recover the property some 12 months later. So again, that's testament to the negotiation skills of the officers as well, going out to persuade the tenant who's subletting to actually hand the property over, rather than have to go through a lengthy legal process. But that's not always the case. So those cases take a lot longer.
Absolutely.
They don't have to go to the courts.
I mean, we want the properties back, let's be honest. We need to get people out of temporary accommodation, many of which is not in the bar. We want to get the families back into the community.
I had another question around London Hub, which ties into the increased costs. So London Hub the London Fraud Hub is something we joined this year. So fraud being the most common crime now in England and Wales. Every industry that I know of is trying to set up a shared fraud system network between each other. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about how it works. Is that sort of based on a central database, or do you ping into each of the boroughs? And I'll ask you some
So the Cabinet Office run a biannual data matching exercise called the National Fraud Initiative. It's referred to in this report. Now, the system that they use, unfortunately, they bring data in every 2 years, but obviously there's huge gaps in between. So what we wanted to do was to use that system, which is very reasonably priced, but to do it as often and as frequently as we like, and to put the data in that we want. So an example being, we talked earlier about the concern of moonlighting. At the moment, we're working across London to use the system to bring in the data from all of our main agencies that we use, in this instance, Pertemps, and I'm pleased to say that they've been in negotiation, they're happy to work with us on this. But to put that in for all of London, and then to put our payroll in, just to make sure that individuals aren't working across two authorities. So really, the system itself is something that, rather than having to wait 2 years to do some good analytics, some good data matching, we can do it as and when. The other one we're currently working on is pensions. Unfortunately, they put in the details of DWP's deceased list on a monthly basis. Therefore, as soon as we can upload pensions, we can upload housing benefit, and also tenancy data, there may well be changes to circumstances that we're not aware of. And this is about preventing as much as it is detecting. Now, it may not be a fraud, but it may be a property that we're not taking advantage of because an elderly person might be in care. Therefore, why are we not recovering this and getting it back as quickly as possible? So the idea of the hub is almost like a depository to put as much data in as possible and as frequently as possible, so that it generates cases for us to tackle. We're also working internally on a bigger system, which is taking all the council data into a similar area, so that it doesn't just benefit us, it benefits all the other departments across the council. So that rather than having to go into 1 or 2 or 3 different systems, one push, we get to see across the piece, we get to see where there are anomalies that might suggest error or fraud.
Just on the fraud of itself as well, the other key benefit will be that as well, because we're putting data in regularly, frontline staff are checking eligibility for services when people apply for services. We'll be able to check in real time, and if there are concerns that get flagged, then it might prevent somebody beginning a service they're not entitled to, rather than having to find it later and go come and take the service or recover the property, whatever. So again, that really helps in terms of preventing fraud happening in the first place.
And just following on from that, it's about embedding that in the services. So saying to them, look, here's an extra tool when you're doing your initial checks to verify, for example, a housing application. Make sure you check this person's name, because we don't want to find out 6 months down the line they already had a property in rent or they already had a property in sale. This way they can check from straight away as part and parcel of their process.
So you're creating a database in which you're adding identities of suspected or proved fraudsters.
No, I'm not going to.
Yeah, because that's why I'm trying to basically for the
absolutely
watching at home trying
absolutely no, it's not. It's not about that at all. It's purely about the data set, and it's about identifying an anomaly. If you're looking for a perfect match, looking for Andy Hyatt here, Hammersmith and Fulham, and Andy Hyatt, let's say Brent, and why has he got a tenancy in 2 properties?
Okay, so you're not building a central database, but you're interrogating each other's databases real time to find out. That's very important.
And yeah, absolutely. And it's, as I say, it's overseen by the Cabinet Office and Secretary of State approval in terms of data matching.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Perfect. I just had a question regarding the moonlighting. I think there's 2 examples put there. They're both agency hires, is that correct? And can I just firstly ask, were they from the same agency?
No, they weren't. Pertemps has a number of smaller agencies underneath them, and they go through them as a conduit, and they weren't from the same agency. What we're asking Pertemps in terms of the data matching and the fraud hub is to say, I don't just want your data, I want the data of the people that feed into you, so that we don't miss anything. One of the problems that sometimes happens with, for example, consultancy staff,
may well be that they've used limited companies and they're slightly harder to try and find. But that in itself is another exercise that we're looking at doing in terms of payroll against company house data for two reasons. One, I suppose most importantly, is to make sure that they're not moonlighting elsewhere, but also for declarations of interest.
Okay. And just the other question I had, more just for the CEO, is just regarding the whistleblowing policy. And just ask, when was the last kind of reminder or training that was given to staff members about the council's whistleblowing policy?
I think quite recently, actually. I remember it was raised at the Audit committee, and again, we went back to people and talent about that and did another push on the whistleblowing. So it is out there and it is actively encouraged and talked about, not just in terms of, you know, something on intranet, but discussion of whistleblowing policy at team meetings so people feel comfortable with that. And of course, it is anonymous. So people can do that without saying who they are, and they can be anonymous.
So it's part of people's regular training.
Encouraged for people to let us know if they've got concerns, whether it's fraud or whether it's something else. You know, it's about another thing that happens is the monitoring officer writes out to all staff and members to say, if you have any issues, please let me know. So it's another sort of way of getting into the system in a confidential way. So we encourage people to talk about things that they're worried about.
Any other, Councillor Pascal-Tilborough?
Thank you very much. On the business grants and construction fund code support, if there's a dash on the floor approved, is that distinct from zero?
No, it is zero. I have my figures from the last couple of years. So, yeah, so as obviously the grants have ceased because of the pandemic, in 2021 we identified an interruption of 46 cases. Last year there was 42 cases that were still being investigated towards the end, so the grants had stopped. And obviously since then we've not had any. So yeah.
Councillor Patel.
Going back to paragraph 1.7, the notional value of recovery from identified fraud was £857,000. The right to buy 133,200 is, that seems a bit on the low side, doesn't it? Bearing in mind how much a property is being sold for. And secondly, there's an item there of internal staff. If you can make more information.
By all means. Actually, Councillor Alexander mentioned this probably 2 meetings ago about the value, and same as yourself, Councillor, identified the lower figure. The reason being is we only discount is 111 at the moment. I might be slightly high, might be 113,000 for property on the right to buy. Now we don't claim the full figure unless we recover a property itself. And the reason being is because what we're doing in many of these instances is actually intervening, deterring, disrupting. So we expect individuals to provide us details of how the purchase is being funded, and we look to them to do checks to make sure that they're resident. Sometimes those requests for information, asking for evidence of how properties are being purchased, sometimes is followed by withdrawal of the application. So we see that as an intervention, as deterred and deterred and prevented fraud. So all we claim is the value of a valuation cost to the council and some administration fees. So about £2,000 is all we would claim on those. However, if we do a right to buy and the investigation results in the recovery of the property as well, then we claim the slightly higher figure. I think there's only one of those higher figure ones last year, and that's why I don't want to end up with sitting here showing huge recoveries of 2-3 million, and then the next day the CEO says to me, "Why can I have some of that money back?" Because it's not there, unfortunately. This is about what we're trying to save the organisation as a whole. So that's the reason behind those ones. In terms of the internal fraud, we just have a small notional figure. If the evidence that we provided leads to a dismissal because we've identified that there was a wrongdoing or the individual have breached the codes of conduct, that's the small figure that we place on it as a notional figure, because we're conscious that whilst we've identified a fraud, what ends up happening is that that person still needs to be replaced. So there's still an ongoing cost for rehiring, advertising for the post, etc. So I don't want to end up. The audit commission used to, and now even the cabinet office say, you should claim the value of the salary over 3 years because that's the expected life of the fraud. But that is far too high because we're not realistic at all. So a lot of my figures are really, I try to be as conservative on them as possible in terms of identifying what I feel is a genuine saving for the organisation.
And what percentage of these resulted in the prosecutions?
In terms of prosecutions, I think prosecutions were quite low last year. I think I may have put a figure in respect of, yeah, just double checking. Yeah, last year we didn't have any prosecutions because we still have the hangover from the last 2 years of pandemic and cases back up. We've got, I can get the figure for you and I'll happily share you offline. We've got a large number of cases at the moment with legal services going through as is. The highlight, I suppose, in terms of prosecutions were ones where our financial investigator supported other departments, which are not claimed on here, where he's done the work to support them and recover cash for the organisation.
Just one last question. Yep. In Appendix 1, the case studies, there's references to tenancy fraud, where the tenant has been from Jamaica, for instance, number 6.
Yeah.
Another tenant was in Grenada, number 11. And number 1, where he was in Dubai. No doubt your council offices are not being carried in because people do go abroad for various reasons, especially if they are going abroad. It's quite common. For instance, my father or my mother and father would go to India during the winter months. It's normal thing to do. I see these investigations which are carried out where people are being found at these properties where the tenants been abroad. Other tenants, whoever's at the premises, not pressurized by way of threats of prosecution. So they say, here's the key. Because these people, as you know, there's no legal aid, there's nothing to protect people these days who are facing repossession.
No, we would not do that in any shape or form. Can't go into too much detail, but we work closely with border agency, getting data that shows to us the comings and goings of an individual, that will show us the time frames. And these time frames are quite long. They're far more than what you'd explained in terms of a family member going for a season or 2. These are long periods of time. We're showing when they're leaving the country and not coming back for long periods of time. We're very conscious of that. And in terms of any pressure, we certainly wouldn't put pressure on individuals in terms of that. And I think we would get complaints from the tenant if that was the scenario. And to my knowledge, we've not received any complaints in terms of the work we've done over the last 3 years.
Councillor Chevalier.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask you what documents are most commonly used for fraud. So, do you find it's driving licenses or?
I think the days of the document identity is probably slightly different now. I think it's more about, we look at, I think from my point, I tend to look at the tools of fraud, and I would look at a mobile phone, an email address, and an address. And those are the ones that individuals use to try to scam. They try to obtain services from the local authority that they wouldn't normally be entitled to. So if they can get hold of an address or access to an address in the borough, that gives them the opportunity to try and claim services within the borough if they're not living. In terms of emails, that's the way now, unfortunately, the way of the world. We tend to contact with residents because it's quick, it's easy. So getting hold of an email address is now becoming a data match. We're talking about data matching. One of the matches that comes from the NFI is where 2 email addresses match between different local authorities. So why is Andy Hyatt popping up here and popping up for a housing benefit claim in this different borough? Sometimes it's relatives who support and help their individuals, or it might be an email that links to CAB. But it is a way of dealing with it. And the same can be said of mobile phones. We're all using our mobile phones. That's a really useful tool for us in terms of combating fraud. We've got access to the Investigating Powers Act, and that means that even as local authority staff, if we can show proportionality and we can show that we have considered all other alternatives, we can look to trace a mobile telephone number and identify mask detail so we know where that's pinging over a set period of time. We get loads of data back. It's amazing how often a mobile phone pings, and we have to sort through that. But it's very useful in some instances of fraud. Certainly even at the triage stage, if we can prove that there's some good corroborative evidence that suggests they're not there, then what we identify, and again, it can be cost effective to do an IP check and try and find out over a period of a week where the pings are, and are they pinging from the address in Hammersmith? Are they just gone away for a day? Are they gone away for a whatever? And that helps us move forward as to whether we take the case forward.
Just to add reassurance around identity documents, so team are all trained how to check identity documents, check they're valid. We've also got other means of checking with agencies as well, to make sure that if documents presented as part of an application, that we can verify their veracity. Yeah.
One of the other data sets that the National Fraud Initiative does is Amber Hill data. So it also checks there to make sure that that information is there.
Yeah, that's super helpful, thank you. I mean, to be fair, your teams can never be trained to border control level to go and face it, it's just nice. Another question I wanted to ask you actually goes back to the councillor's question. It's to talk about the people who find out that they're actually renting somewhere that's being subletted, and what happens to them when they find out. Because it can be quite brutal, and I'm guessing on quite short periods of time you need to leave your house.
Not always short periods, I have to say. The housing are very supportive on that. They will be renting occupation if necessary to help the individual transition between that property and move into move into other accommodations, which are not affordable housing, moving into market rate accommodation. So that support is there from our housing department. They will give them a period of grace to try and move on. It's not immediate. I do appreciate it's horrible. We try to give them appointment in advice areas. So we have a leaflet for CAB, which we give to the individual so that there is somewhere that we can try to point them to, and we point them to our own housing solution services. They're not always, unfortunately, eligible for housing. So it is a case that perhaps trying to guide them as best we can via CAB is the only route often.
That's very helpful, thank you. Two final questions. The first one is to say, actually, where can I check that I'm not in that situation? And a lot of the cases are resolved through residents actually sharing information with you. How can residents share information with you?
Again, a while back, we did probably 12 months, and actually, from some of the points that you've raised tonight, Councillor, it's got my mind racing in terms of doing more comms on this. We were looking to do some additional internal comms around, funny enough, whistleblowing, because obviously we want to publicise the fact we use the independent hotline, and we want to reinvigorate some of the training, because we see learning training just needs updating on a more regular basis. We're also doing fraud awareness training, trying to make that compulsory to our training. However, we do need to get more comms out. It's available on the internet. There is details of how to contact my service. However, not everyone has access to the internet, which is why 12 months ago we worked with resident tenancy associations and give some leaflets out, certainly for the elderly generation who may not have moved into the technological environment. So we made sure that there was a very simple form. We left it at a number of libraries and sites around the borough so that they could complete that and send it in to us, because some people would prefer to do that, because let's be honest, there's still some individuals who will be concerned that we can trace the IP address and work out who they are. As you see from one of our cases. Not that we would do it for someone who sends a referral in, but they do get scared of that. So we say to them, here's the form, put the form in, and we're happy with your cases.
And as we can previously, we encourage councils to bring any cases that we're on the doorstep that are concerned to myself or Andy's attention, and we'll make sure they get investigated. So again, as well as residents, you're part of our eyes and ears out in the borough as well. So it's really helpful any concerns you've got about any particular properties that we can look into it.
And especially if someone comes to a surgery, which we mentioned earlier, or if you're out canvassing, any information that looks a little bit, don't worry how small it might seem, we're happily looking at it and have our assurance that we triage it and make sure that it's reasonable evidence to progress it. So if you do have a concern, please come to us and make those reports.
That's really great. And the first part of my question was, how can I check that I'm not being sublet?
It's an awkward one because again, data protection is an issue. If you contacted the council, we wouldn't necessarily be in a position to tell you whether or not you are. I suppose the easiest way, I'm trying to think. I'll take that one away. I will come back to you. There was going to be, at one time, there was a consideration for a system where individuals, basically the idea was to get letting agencies to put details in and to check against a housing system. Unfortunately, we couldn't complete a peer, so we just didn't feel it was appropriate to do, so we never joined that scheme. In fact, there was only one I think there that did that scheme where individuals could type their address in to see whether or not they were sublet. Problem is that effectively to do that, we've got to tell you that that's a council property, and that's the risk, and that's why we've shied away from that. But I'll have a think whether there is a route that you could follow that would ensure that you're not breaching data protection, or the local authority is not breaching data protection, to give you some assurance that it's not.
It's interesting. So you talk one case is Marshall Carson also actually engaging in a rental collection agreement with someone for a subletted property. So in the same way, you're doing the London hub, maybe there's there's a lot. I appreciate there's a lot of challenges there.
As I say, the idea originally was that a depository, effectively, there would be a single system where we could put out all our tenancy data. When I say tenancy data, this is just all the tenancies, our own stock, into a single place. And the idea was to allow letting agencies, so that they don't have to found it, to go in and to check. But again, my concern was always the fact that people don't want to disclose the fact that they have a council property. So therefore, we were breaching their confidentiality. So we now moved it forward, unfortunately. But I will have a consideration.
One area I'll check is I think on my plan registry you can do a very basic check.
Yeah.
On ownership.
Yeah,
property.
£3. That will tell you what surgery says minimum.
Yeah.
If someone contacted the council and made an inquiry, the council then look into that.
Yeah.
They might not come back to that person, but they would very quickly move if there was a subletting.
And if, we're back in touch if there was a concern.
Yes.
So one more reason to get in touch with your local councillor when you move it.
Yes, absolutely.
The council will then look at it.
Thank you.
Councillor Alexander.
My understanding is that local authority search, you can show subletting if it's listed of certain title. It's simply one type, one property under one title, and the property is being subletted. I'm not sure. Just a bit of caveat.
Councillor Alexander.
Yes, it's kind of a question, but first the more easy one, just as a point of my question. On the right to buy, people got a legal right to make an application, and we must progress that by law, otherwise we with that. Now, at what point, I know lots and lots of tenants, and some of them have got a glass file strung together, but they will be sitting there wondering what they're going to do today. So they say, they'd be interested to see how much I wanted to buy, which is totally in their legal right. So they do that, and of course it's never going to go anywhere. So it's just wondering at what point you get involved, because if you presumably got involved at that point, you would just have a whole bunch of work to do. So it's purely to understand.
It is at that point we get involved, really, because what we're doing is and I want this to sound wrong, but actually if an individual is curious, should the local authority be paying for the valuation for their curiosity? That would probably be my challenge back. But so what we do is we basically say to them, are you going to be a genuine applicant, and can you show us where the funds are coming from? And that also leads into fraud, because where you may have an elderly relative, a son, a daughter, who may not live there, may be the person funding that, and that breaches the criteria.
So if I just pick apart what you touched on, you get involved at the point, because there's quite a few other stages before we get that. So it would be the stage where the local authority is going to put its hand in its pocket to get surveys done. That's the point at which you get involved, rather than the point at which they go online.
Before before the surveys are done, because that's why we claim that as a social mistake.
So the other two areas of tensible. So the one that is a real difficult one is succession on tenancies. And just for anybody who, someone who might not understand the implications of that, are a tenancy can be succeeded once. And a common scenario is the kids have left home, they've gone off and done anything, then mum and dad are getting elderly, and one of them may have passed on, or the brother and one. So one of the youngsters who grew up there moves back quite legitimately, and they're doing the job as a carer, and just getting on with that, and then the tenant dies, and I'm sure there's people who try it on, but I've not had one. I'm aware of those that they do. I've not had one, but I'm aware of some people who, not long after they're putting mum in the ground, they are getting housing officers behaving in the most appalling way. And this is a story before your time, so please don't nibble into behaving appallingly, and to the point where people have tried to take their own lives because they're being accused of fraud and being faced with homelessness at the same time. So that is a difficult one, and it's just the other one, which is a more difficult one for you to is the transfer fraud, or the key money, and that's where, let's say somebody from the Caribbean island, but they've worked all their life hard here. So I'm picking up work now, retiring. I'm going to go back to the country of my birth happily. Now, they walk around the housing office and they'll hand the keys back, and then somebody tells me, tell you what, I'll give you 10 grand to do a transfer with me, because I've got an old dump of a bed sitting right outside of London somewhere, and that will either be just because they want to value that, or will be at a later date when it will be too late to do anything. It will then turn into a right to buy, because if you go up to some of the other parts of the country, the right to buy will not be, the cap won't even come into it, because the 66% will cover it, so they will then they'll get a 3-bedroom house with the right to buy for 30 grand in another part of the country, but obviously not, so there's a difference in there. I remember seeing adverts in your Fulham Chronicle, people saying, and actually openly advertising, for cash thank you for somebody. Is that something that I know it's very difficult.
No, it's not a problem. I think succession is slightly easier for us. So with the criteria for succession, the person succeeded has to have lived at the property for 12 months prior to the individual deceased. So that's slightly easier because we can go back and check records. We can look, for example, the person that's passed away may have been claiming single person discount prior to their death. They may have been getting welfare benefit again as a single person. So some of the signs there suggest the individual probably didn't live there. Our next job is to try and find out where did they live. And again, we have ways of trying to trace the individual to show actually you never lived here for the 12 months prior to the individual deceased. So successions are a little bit easier to investigate. Assignments are quite hard because the individual who's assigned it is there and able to say, yeah, they're going to assign the property from me. I want to assign it to them. And what you even get is fictitious partnerships. So that someone says, well, that's my partner I'm assigning it to. When there may be age differences, huge age differences, but unfortunately they're trying to prove us. They're slightly harder to prove, and our housing colleagues will ask a number of questions to try and verify the veracity of that assignment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I do sometimes wonder that we, in my casework, I also deal with housing associations and that they have successions. And we don't have, despite being in the same borough, we don't have processes that are instantly aligned or recognisable for succession, even though it's still based upon one.
We would offer our services, if it's appropriate, on the basis that if we recover that property, that comes back to the council. Yeah. So in a weird way, it's almost like no fee, no key. Yeah. And that's what we're trying to say to the local, all the housing associations that operate across the borough. We're here to try and support you because it's back under protection. It's about protecting the community. And we're not, as much as our first primary role is to protect our own stock, we will assist where we can and try to help them. Successions, they have different criteria, and I think that's one of the issues. You're quite right. Their criteria doesn't always align to ours, and it's slightly harder for us to help in that respect because there may not always be a property that comes back for us to be able to allocate. I can't give them free work. I can only give them work if there's something in it for those. Happy chat offline.
Yeah, it is this idea, and again, I just probably look to my colleagues. So the way the succession works, many times the tendency is just in one of the mum and dad's names, in mum or dad, and the succession will depend on which one dies first. So if it's in dad's name and mum dies first, then you get the tenancy. Straightforward. However, if dad dies first and then mum dies 6 months later, you won't, because they will say that the tenants, because it was husband and wife, the tenant has succeeded on.
They can do a discretionary succession, so they will look at whether or not it's appropriate. So, for example, if that child had been living there and the housing officer knew there was clear evidence that that individual had left there, they can consider a discretionary succession. I will double check that with my colleagues in housing for clarity, but I'm almost certain that that is available because it would be unfair to make the child homeless if they live there. Regardless of who's died first.
So it is. You can see the
absolutely. I totally see where you're coming from. It would be completely unfair. Just if they've grown up in that house and never moved. So I will clarify it with housing colleagues, and I'll get you some details as to what the criteria is in those instances. Because it may help, I suppose, if you're getting those.
What you're saying, that's fantastic. That shows we are compassionate council, but we'll have to see what. Thank you very much.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Pascal-Talbot.
Thank you very much. Two very quick ones for me. Firstly, it's interesting to see the risk is differentiated between high risk and low risk. Wondered what the question was.
Should refresh one that goes on. What happens when I go and look? Yeah, so in terms of criteria, it links into our fraud risk register. Fraud risk register, for obvious reason, isn't published because obviously it tells what our risks are and we try to mitigate it. But it's based on the idea of what are the levels of risk And the risk register will scale it in the same way that we scale risk, and that gives us our high medium. I hope that helps.
Thanks. And the next one, and I hope I speak for many others on the committee, that we want to note paragraphs 4.22 to 4.26 and welcome the great news around Richard Winfield Dublin and the award they've had.
Very well said, thank you. I'll thank you for your congratulations. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Okay, in that case, the recommendation is to note the report.
Very good.
Anybody else? Okay. All right, moving along to item number 6, which is the risk management update. And can I ask David Hughes to introduce the item?
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, committee. So before I do introduce the paper, I'd just like to introduce to you Jules Binney, who's sat next to me, who's our new risk and assurance manager. He joined in July. So I'll just get Jules to say a few words of introduction about himself, and then I'll introduce the report.
Okay. Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for everybody here. Yes, I have come. I've just joined less than a month ago. I come from a background of audit, assurance, risk, PMO, not in local authorities, but I've worked in corporate organisations, similar large organisations such as Network Rail and Visa. So my experience has come from all those organisations, both managing and looking after risk, and also being a programme manager. So I stood on both sides of the fence.
And Jules joins us as a sovereign risk and assurance manager, so he's solely dedicated to Hammersmith and Fulham workers on a full-time basis, which is a change from our previous arrangement. So again, good to have Jules on board to support the team, support Shannon and SLT in terms of the management of risk, and you as a committee in terms of being assured around the risk management arrangement. So really good addition to the team. So thank you, Jules. Thank you. So as we do at each committee meeting, we bring the risk registry. So it's been reviewed by SLT last month. There are no new risks to report being added. We're obviously still keeping a very close eye on the impact of the economy and inflation on services, because that's something that's having on local authorities generally is having a significant effect in a period of ongoing austerity, where you've got price inflation, you've got contract inflation, construction inflation, pay inflation, and you've got demand for services increasing, which particularly in London is something that's quite prevalent. So it's very much the focus for SLT around the impact, that thematic impact of the economy across the risk register, which we're still keeping an eye on. As I said, there are no new risks we're adding. We're suggesting and recommending to close one of the risks, which was risk 33, which was added around supporting accommodation providers. So we moved to a position now where that's being dealt with effectively either in terms of the properties being transferred to another provider, so we've got surety around where those residents will be looked after going forward, or whether council is looking at business cases to acquire properties to again protect the residents in those properties. So that's something we're downgrading in terms of scores. The Directorate Risk Register will still contain it, so it'll still be tracked. If it increases, it'll come back. So just to reassure, it's not gone. It's something that we'll be keeping on at a directorate level. We're reducing the risk score for the Civic Campus programme, so that's primarily down to the fact that work is now recommenced across the whole site. There's a clear programme in place to deliver work, and good progress has been made in the contractual commercial arrangements there as well. The other thing we've done is we've amended the risk narrative for risk 3. So we'll be talking a bit later about cyber security on the agenda, but what we've done is reflect in the impact on residents of IT systems failing. We've incorporated in there the risk of us being reliant as a council on third-party suppliers for multiple systems. So if that third party was to have an attack, it would have a significant impact on the council. So we're seeking reassurances from those providers to make sure they've got good cybersecurity arrangements in place themselves to mitigate the impact of any attack on themselves that we have for residents. As we've done in the past, we've got the heat maps there for you to see. There's the changes that happen over time. Apologies for the typo on the top chart, which should say Q1 2024. So you Councillor Shepherd earlier would have spotted it. So, and again, it's something that we want to make sure that if you have thoughts around where we might have gaps in the register, it'd be helpful to hear those, but also where you might want to have a bit more exploration of particular risks at future meetings as well, where we can ask officers to come and talk about a particular risk on the register as well. I'm more than happy to do that. So I have to pause there and take any questions.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions? Councillor Shivot,
Thank you. Just more an observation. We had a discussion in this committee previously whether to actually shorten, remove some risks. I think in hindsight, I originally was for shortening it, but I think it is good to have that level of detail, and as you advised us in that sense previously, I think it is really helpful to have that level of granularity, and so yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
and Councillor Patel.
Page 66, failure to deliver the civil campus program. Can you tell us what the additional costs are going to be of that failure, or is that confidential?
So the additional cost of
The delay due to the impact of the site incident.
I think work is being done on that at the minute by officers. That's something we can
Yes,
come back on.
and that isn't known yet because we're obviously having that very forensic then, because there will be an insurance claim and there will be discussions with contractor. So there will be a claim by the council, because at this moment in time we can't.
And it's a contractor.
Well, there will be insurance claims,
Yes.
and there'll also be something regarding the contractor, but obviously those are at the moment commercially sensitive and not known to us because they're being properly looked at to assess what they will be.
And just the other thing is, one of them is identified, unable to retain identified people in key posts as at the borough. Do you have any explanation for that?
So I think across London, this ties in perhaps to the piece we were talking about earlier, the reliance of London boroughs on agency workers. So there are key areas of roles. The social care is one of them. There's some of the professional areas like planning, for example, where actually it's difficult to recruit officers and retain officers in permanent roles, and there's a greater reliance on agency. So actually lots of London boroughs are facing these challenges. So yeah, Hammersmith and Fulham is very good at looking at how it recruits and retains and suitable talent and grows talent within. So it's got good programs to encourage people to develop within the organisation. A good sort of package it can offer to officers coming into the organisation, but there are challenges in different particular disciplines that each authority across London is facing. So we're all fishing from a small pond, effectively.
And there's 32 boroughs.
Yes.
So you are all constantly, it's very easy to move borough, and it's also easy now to move to a place where home working will be available and you can move out of town. So these are very challenging times. But recently we had our long service awards, and I was very, very impressed with the amount of people at 40, 30 and 20 years service with Hammersmith and Fulham. So they were there in great number. So clearly the council's doing some things right in order to keep people that long, because they could easily move borough, and many of them were residents, which is also very impressive. But particularly the longer service, because obviously it's quite challenging to live in the borough if you're a younger person and work for the council.
Councillor Shivot,
Just to say, I can vouch for that because I was handing out medals. It was exhausting. Brexit. We were connected to one of the largest employment pools in the world, a skilled market, skilled labour, etc. Now for people, and as we know, these workers are about to increase. So yes, we're stuck on our own. So again, particular aspects, particularly social care, home care is a good example of that, where there's lots of pressure on sort of capacity. So again, I know that colleagues are working in social care around, rather than having larger contracts with large providers, actually having smaller contracts with smaller local providers. That's actually helping to stimulate that resilience in the market. I think the other thing, which it's not unique to our team, but Hammersmith and Fulham is very good at, is actually recruiting apprenticeships as well. So across London, there's an ageing local government workforce. So actually bringing in new talent, young talent, growing your own is a really important thing. Hammersmith and Fulham has a really good record for recruiting and retaining apprenticeships and for encouraging apprenticeships to the ranks as well.
And the Get Ahead programme, which is encouraging staff who've joined to move through the ranks, and also addressing issues of gender diversity. We do embrace and we do want a diverse workplace and get the best out of mixed teams, which is really important, reflecting our residents.
Excellent. Are there any other questions? Councillor Patel. Councillor Alexander.
Sorry, yeah, I think it's within the scope of what we're talking about, but it's at the edge and just scouring it. So we have to have fraud protection, and that's part of our policy. And tenancies are important. That's one of our important products that we protect. It's my perception, definitely my perception, that sometimes the baby's going out with the bathwater, and the area that I'm thinking about are when we've got legitimate residents wanting to transfer, and this will be transfer from housing associations to they're placing their records on the housing register, seem to be purged every 6 months, and they were told that 4. So when the transfer takes longer than they've envisaged, and it all doesn't go through, they actually have to start the whole process. Bank statements and everything else all to be checked, even if it's only a matter of months. And I've got this here, sheltered housing residents who are wanting to move from an upstairs flat to a vacant downstairs flat. They can't because they've got to re-go on the housing register because of housing fraud checks. And I've got ones where something in a housing association 2-bed wants to downsize to council 1-bed in a particular area because it's round the corner from all the neighbours and all that stuff, and they can't get in quickly enough to get, because the whole housing register thing's to be done. Now, I don't want you to slacken up on and open any floodgates, but I would like to see a lot less problematical transfers, because transfers tend to be time related, and people think about a transfer because they say, oh, there's a place around the corner. That'd be great because I'd still be in touch with my neighbours and whatever else. So I can downsize from a 2-bed to a 1-bed, and it can be 3-4 months of processing to get them back on the housing register, despite the fact that they're a social housing bed, by which time it's gone. And therefore, we've now lost out on a 2-bed down to a 1-bed. So we've lost out on bedroom that way, which again, sometimes protecting the system does mean it's going to be a bit of collateral. So I've got to really ask, is that's the problem? Solution.
Chair, we will look at the downsizing policy and see if there's anything we can do on that, because it's important to release the bigger homes for families. So if people are interested, and I need to get updated on it, but I have asked previously, our service was different and more robust on people downsizing, to try and support them to downsize, even with their removals, costs, etc. So I will look at that.
And there are mistakes done in processing, and they're always on the overcautious side, which again I'm not going to complain about that. But maybe I'll just send you 2 or 3 sharing which are the upstairs level.
Definitely do that.
That would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Councillor Pastor.
Thank you very much. With due to telling the residents those groups, can I ask on outcomes and next steps for 2 issues? The first is the ongoing conversations with the social housing regulator, and also the approval process for many works.
Okay, so in terms of the risk that we've got there about the housing regulator, we have recently met with the housing regulator and provided information about our decent homes, our standards and our monitoring. This area of the operation of housing is very robust indeed. And we receive regular reports and we achieve high standards. So these are the things like gas monitoring, electricity, lifts, water, all of those key standards. Obviously the interest was because we'd had a number of severe maladministrations by the Ombudsman. These relate to the period of 2021, coming out of COVID, when some of the repairs were suspended and then some contractual issues. So we analysed what the issues were. It then meant that the Ombudsman had a backlog, so we didn't get those determinations and trickling through until the start, till around the summer, autumn last year. And of course, if you have a backlog, then when you start to determine them, then they all come to us. And we have obviously learned lots of lessons from that and changed our processes, and we've put more contractor capacity in place and better complaint handling and trained our staff and reinforced the policies. But with a journey of transformation, members, it does take some time because you're taking people on a journey and they have to be trained, procedures have to be refreshed. So it isn't an overnight automatic, you can say, oh, this is all let's straight, because it's a sizable service and there's lots of points at which you need to influence, not least the contractors. So we had 3 term contractors, one of those contractors failed, performance was poor, and the work was taken over by the first in line contractor, and then they struggled with it. They struggled because of what you just talked about, which is labour capacity, trades, getting hold of people in London, and everybody's trying to do the same, all the London boroughs needing their contractors to step up. And this was a very, very difficult time for the authority. But lots of strategic input has gone in, and we've put investments in to turn this around. We're not committing to changing the regs to the Amber's degree, but that is the direction that we should be going on it. And obviously, that sort of thing, that sort of level of change does take longer than we would like. But when it's fixed, it will be a very, very good service, and one we'll be proud of. We're not there yet, but that's the direction that we're going in. And then you mentioned also the works.
The procurement for the works.
So the stabilisation works, they will be coming to conclusion in the early autumn. So what is good about that is then we have a bridge that's absolutely stable and safe. The next part of the process we'll be discussing with our colleagues at DF2 and TfL, a part of that tripartite arrangement. And we have obviously given the DF2 the business plan to obviously get the rest of the bridge refurbished. But we get to hear about the outcome of that, because it's a very rigorous process when the government is going to look at granting money, not just to us, but to TfL and its own share. So that's where we're currently are with it.
And presumably procurement is dependent on that.
Exactly. We do have to have the money.
Thank you. In that case, is there any final questions? All right. Thank you. So the recommendation is, do members agree to note the head of internal audit's opinion on the accuracy and effectiveness of the council's framework of governance, risk management? Oh, sorry, wrong one. Next one. Do members note the report?
No.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, David. Moving on to item 7. The head of internal audit annual report for 22 and 23, and can I ask Maureen to introduce the item?
Thank you, Chair. So, as you just mentioned, this is the annual report, which gives us some assurance to the council on their risk governance and control environment. I think you're all regular committee members, so you know that obviously we report regularly on the process of the progress of our audit plan, what's coming through, where we've had any limited assurance audits, and also highlighted those that have been substantial. So over the course of the year, it was a fairly steady run of satisfactory or substantial assurances with very few limited. I think I mentioned at the meetings themselves, there were 3 schools, but you have to look at them in context. Schools are a much smaller environments than, say, the other two areas that were limited assurance. So you have to look at it in perspective. I also just wanted to mention that it's not just about the audits. We take assurances from other areas as well. David and myself have conversations in lots of different areas about what's going on. And one of the key processes and systems that supports the council is the Hampshire system, the Integrated Business Centre. And we don't audit them because it's a contained environment, but they do have it audited and they provide us with assurances. What we do look at is how the council staff and officers interact with that, and because there are controls that the council must put in place. So we look at that as well. So this is sort of wrapping all that up together to give you a feel that things are okay. And this actually feeds into the annual governance statement as well. So when you get to see the accounts, probably in September, I'm thinking, your annual governance statement will be there, and this will, if there's anything significant and it's not maybe been addressed within the time span, that may be flagged in there. I think the only thing that's flagged in there is potentially the housing issues, which you're already fully aware of. And obviously we look at follow-ups for all of our work with a particular focus on the limited assurance, of course, and those follow-ups are being undertaken at the moment. That was really what I was going to say.
Thank you, Maura. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Councillor Patel.
Yeah, page 74. There's 80%, 86% of audits receiving a positive assurance opinion. It was lower than last year. Last year was 91%. Is there any reason for that?
I was going to say, from my point of view, anything over 80% is good, because actually we have a risk-based approach to audit. So we're looking for areas, and management are coming to us for areas that they're suggesting are of higher risk. So actually, to have anything that's a territory of above 80% is good. Given the number of audits we do, it's going to fluctuate from year to year a little bit. So I don't have any issue. I'm comfortable with that small change in the number of positive assurance audits. So it's a good high number, good high percentage to be having.
And second question, page 82, Hotel Primary School, high risk, high priority recommendation 4. What's all that about?
So there are 4. When that review was conducted, and we reported to you in March, the March committee, there were 4 high priority recommendations that were made, but the school agreed to take action. So we'll be following up on that in the autumn to make sure that they've implemented those, and we'll be reporting back here to you that those actions have been implemented.
If I remember rightly, there were a lot of changes going on at the school at the time, and we struggled to even get the response on the audit because of the changes in business management and stuff like that. So there are a lot of things they couldn't evidence for us, so that's why they got quite a lot of high priority recommendations.
Are there any further questions? Okay. In that case, to read the recommendations properly this time, do members agree to note the head of internal audit's opinion on the accuracy and effectiveness of the council's framework of governance, risk management and control environment in paragraph or para 10? Is that agreed?
Yes.
Agreed.
Perfect. In that case, we move on to item 8, which is the cybersecurity update. Now, this item includes an appendix that contains exempt information. Discussion of the appendices will require the passing of a proposed resolution at the end of the agenda to exclude members of the public and the press. This item excludes. Sorry, this item. Do members agree to this?
Yes.
Agreed. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so after the officer has introduced the open report, we shall stop the live stream and invite guests and members of the public, if there are any, which there are not, to leave before entering into the exempt item. Can I ask Tina, I'm sorry, not sure, to introduce the open report?
Thank you, Chair. So this item provides an update on Hammersmith and Fulham's cybersecurity readiness. That's the only open part.
Okay. In that case,